After being publicly humiliated on a routine flight, a dignified black family endures an act of degradation that defies all expectations. Their unjust treatment conceals a secret so explosive that it challenges every notion of power and pride. What begins as a moment of crushing humiliation soon unravels into a revelation that will force the world to question who truly commands the skies. Watch until the end to see how this incredible story unfolds, and let us know what time you're watching today. The day began with a gray, unsettled sky that stretched over the airport like a heavy shroud. Margaret stood by a large window in the terminal, watching raindrops race each other down the glass. Each droplet shimmered in the weak morning light, a small reflection of the turmoil swirling within her. The soft patter of rain mingled with the distant hum of early travelers. But for Margaret, the sound was a constant reminder of the inner storm she had carried for far too long. She had been a flight attendant for many years, a role that once filled her with pride and purpose. In the beginning, every flight felt like a small adventure, a chance to connect with people from all walks of life as they journeyed to new destinations. But lately, the routine of her job has taken on a different flavor. Instead of the thrill of adventure, each day seemed to pile on more weight, more doubts about the rules she was expected to enforce. Today, as she looked out at the drizzling rain, she felt that weight more keenly than ever. Margaret took a deep breath and stepped away from the window. The airport's interior was busy yet strangely impersonal, a place where thousands of lives briefly intersected without ever truly connecting. The polished floors reflected the bright overhead lights, and the murmur of conversations created a constant background score to the steady click of rolling suitcases. Even among the crowd, she could sense an undercurrent of tension, a sense that something was not quite right. The atmosphere felt charged, as if every soul present carried a secret burden. As she made her way to the crew lounge, Margaret's mind wandered back over the long years of her career. She recalled moments when she had been forced to choose between following strict protocols and listening to the quiet voice inside her that urged compassion over rigidity. There had been times when enforcing the rules had meant turning away those in need, times when the very act of upholding order had revealed hidden cracks in a system that promised fairness but often delivered only division. The memories filled her with a mixture of regret and a burning question. Had she become a pawn of a system that no longer served the people it was meant to protect? Inside the crew lounge, the muted sound of conversations and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee offered a brief reprieve from her swirling thoughts. Margaret sank into a worn chair, its familiar leather a small comfort amid the chaos of her inner reflections. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to center herself. In that quiet space, she remembered the words of a mentor who had once told her, "Rules can guide you, but they should never blind you to the truth of a person's heart." Those words now echoed in her mind, stirring a sense of uncertainty about the path she had been following for so long. A gentle knock on the door brought her back to the present. James, a fellow crew member with an ever-friendly smile, entered the room and greeted her warmly. "Good morning, Margaret," he said softly, as if aware of the heaviness in her demeanor. His kind words provided a momentary lift, a small spark of normalcy amid the turbulence she felt inside. She managed a faint smile in return, grateful for the simple kindness even as her heart continued to wrestle with its own doubts. Margaret glanced at the clock on the wall, its ticking a steady reminder that time marched forward, indifferent to her inner conflicts. With a resigned sigh, she rose and headed toward the boarding area for Flight 217, a routine flight to a busy southern city that, today, seemed anything but routine. As she walked, the terminal revealed its many layers. Rows of seats filled with travelers lost in thought, digital displays announcing upcoming departures, and the constant shuffle of feet on the polished floor. All the while, Margaret felt a deep, unspoken connection to the very air around her, a tension that hinted at changes on the horizon. The sound of her footsteps echoed softly as she passed by a group of passengers gathered near a departure gate. Among them, a family of four caught her eye. They sat quietly together, their expressions calm and dignified despite the bustle around them. There was an air about them that spoke of unity and unyielding strength, a silent bond that made them seem both ordinary and extraordinary at once. Margaret's mind briefly wandered to thoughts of her own family and the times when simple togetherness had once been enough to soothe her troubled spirit. Boarding the plane, Margaret moved down the aisle with the practiced precision of someone who had done this countless times before. Yet today, every step felt loaded with meaning. The narrow cabin was filled with soft murmurs, the rustling of newspapers, and the occasional quiet laugh from a passenger settling into their seat. Overhead, the compartments closed with a satisfying click, sealing away the personal belongings that held each traveler's hopes and secrets. As Margaret passed by, she caught her reflection in the small window panels, her eyes dark with uncertainty, her smile not quite reaching the depths of her gaze. A small commotion near the back of the cabin momentarily distracted her. A child's toy had slipped from a seat and fallen with a soft clatter onto the aisle floor. Margaret quickly stooped to pick it up, her fingers brushing lightly against the fabric of a nearby seat. In that small act, she felt a strange mix of tenderness and responsibility, a reminder that even the smallest moments could hold great significance. The toy, with its faded colors and worn edges, seemed to embody the innocence that she feared was slowly being lost in the harsh realities of the world. In that brief pause, Margaret's thoughts turned inward. She wondered if her strict adherence to rules, meant to maintain order, had in fact closed her off from the genuine emotions of those around her. Had her focus on duty blinded her to the simple humanity that connected everyone in that cramped space? These questions, like echoes in an empty room, stirred deep within her. Every decision she had made felt like a step along an uncertain path, a path that might lead to redemption or further into regret. Outside the plane, the weather shifted subtly. The light drizzle intensified into a soft rain, the steady tapping of droplets against the windows now a rhythmic accompaniment to her troubled thoughts. Margaret moved carefully along the aisle, ensuring that each passenger was attended to with a polite smile and a gentle word. Yet, beneath that surface, she wrestled with an inner conflict that grew more pronounced with each passing moment. The familiar safety of routine was giving way to something far more unpredictable, a sense that the very order she had long protected was now on the brink of unraveling. Throughout the flight, Margaret's eyes wandered from one passenger to another. She noticed the way a tired businessman started absently out the window, lost in his own worries, and the quiet confidence of a young woman who sat reading a book, completely absorbed in her own world. But was the family she had seen earlier that continued to occupy her thoughts. Their calm presence, the unspoken solidarity they displayed, seemed to challenge everything she had come to believe about the structure of her everyday life. It was as if they carried a secret strength, a quiet defiance that she both admired and feared. As the hours passed, and the plane sailed steadily above the vast expanse of clouds, the interior of the cabin grew quieter. The initial excitement of boarding had settled into a hushed stillness, punctuated only by the soft murmur of conversations and the steady hum of the engines. In that silence, Margaret found herself alone with her thoughts. She leaned against a closed door in the service area, the cool metal a stark contrast to the warmth of her skin, and allowed herself a moment of introspection. She recalled a flight not so long ago, where a small disagreement had escalated unexpectedly, revealing deep-seated biases that neither she nor anyone else had wished to acknowledge. The memory was vivid. The tense faces, the raised voices, and the heavy silence that had followed the confrontation. That day had changed something in her. A crack had formed in the carefully maintained facade of professionalism. Now, as she reflected on those past events, she wondered if she was once again on the brink of a similar turning point. The realization filled her with a quiet dread, but also with a stirring of resolve. Perhaps it was time to question the very rules she had always followed so faithfully. Margaret thought of the countless passengers who had passed through the cabin, each one a brief chapter in a long, complicated story. In their eyes, she saw hints of joy and sorrow, of unspoken dreams and hidden fears. Each person was a reminder that behind every rule lay a human story, a story too often overlooked in the pursuit of order. As she stood there, the steady thrum of the engines and the muted conversations around her faded into the background, replaced by the louder, more persistent voice of her own doubts. Outside, the rain continued to fall steadily, its gentle rhythm a counterpoint to the chaotic beat of her heart. The plane, carrying its precious cargo of dreams and disappointments, soared through a sky filled with gray clouds that promised change. Margaret felt the vibration of the engines under her feet, a tangible reminder of the journey they were all on, one that was as unpredictable as it was inevitable. In that moment, every sense was heightened. The low murmur of the passengers, the soft rustle of fabric, and even the distant sound of a crying baby contributed to a tapestry of emotion that Margaret could not escape. Her thoughts drifted back to the family she had seen earlier. There was something about their quiet presence that had captivated her, a certain dignity that defied the ordinary. She remembered the way the father's eyes held a mix of kindness and unyielding determination, how the mother's gentle smile spoke of resilience in the face of adversity, and the way the children clung together as if in silent defiance of the challenges life had set before them. In that small moment, the family had become more than just another group of passengers. They had become a symbol of the strength and vulnerability that lay hidden in every heart. As the flight continued its long journey through the shifting skies, Margaret's internal battle grew more intense. Every small interaction with the passengers, every polite exchange of words, served as both a reminder of her duty and a challenge to her conscience. She found herself questioning the very nature of the rules that governed her work. Were they truly meant to protect, or were they barriers that separated people from understanding one another? The more she pondered these questions, the more the comfortable certainty of her former life seemed to crumble, replaced by a disquieting awareness of the complexities that lay beneath the surface of everyday interactions. In the quiet moments between serving meals and assisting with small inconveniences, Margaret's mind wandered to the possibilities of change. She thought about the mentor who had once encouraged her to see beyond the strict boundaries of protocol, to listen to the unspoken stories in each passenger's eyes. Those lessons had been buried under layers of routine and duty, but now they stirred within her like a long-forgotten melody. The melody spoke of empathy, of breaking free from the confines of blind obedience, and of the transformative power of understanding. It was a soft, persistent call that urged her to look at the world with fresh eyes, a call that was as unsettling as it was hopeful. By the time the plane began its slow descent toward its destination, the storm outside had eased into a light, steady rain. The first hints of morning light broke through the gray clouds, casting a gentle glow over the cabin. Margaret's heart pounded with a mix of anxiety and anticipation. As the seatbelt sign was turned off and passengers began to gather their belongings, she took one last look at the faces around her, each one etched with its own story of hope and hardship. In that silent moment, she made a quiet promise to herself, a promise to no longer let the rigid rules blind her to the humanity in every person she encountered. Stepping off the plane into the cool, dewy morning, Margaret felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. The terminal was now filled with the soft sounds of early travelers reuniting with loved ones or beginning their own journeys. Yet, beneath the everyday bustle, she sensed that something significant was about to unfold, a moment that would force her to confront the hidden truths of her past and the uncertain future that lay ahead. With each step she took, the promise of a new beginning mingled with the lingering echoes of regret, urging her to embrace the possibility of change. In that moment, the day had transformed from a routine flight into a quiet prelude to an unforeseen confrontation, a confrontation that would challenge everything Margaret had ever known about order, duty, and the true meaning of compassion. As she walked through the terminal, her thoughts remained with the family she had seen on board, their quiet strength a beacon in the midst of her internal storm. The rain had washed the world clean for a brief time, and in that cleansing moment, Margaret felt that perhaps, just perhaps, there was a chance to start anew. The journey ahead was filled with uncertainty, and Margaret knew that the road to redemption was never simple. Yet, as she continued on, every step felt like a small act of defiance against the forces that had long dictated her life. The soft light of the new day, the murmur of voices, and the gentle persistence of hope all converged to create a fragile, yet undeniable promise that even amidst uncertainty and the shadows of past mistakes, a new chapter could begin. With a quiet determination taking root in her heart, Margaret moved forward into the brightening morning, ready to face whatever challenges the day might bring. The world around her was a tapestry of intertwined lives, each with its own struggles and dreams, and in that realization, she found the courage to question the old rules and to search for a deeper truth. The journey was only the beginning, and with it, the possibility of finding not just order in the chaos, but compassion in a world that had too long been divided by fear and misunderstanding. And so, as the terminal doors closed behind her and the cool morning air embraced her, Margaret took her first steps toward a future that was as uncertain as it was filled with promise. A future where every heartbeat, every breath, carried the hope of transformation, and where the seeds of change, though fragile, held the power to reshape her world forever. Margaret moved down the narrow aisle with careful steps, each footfall echoing in the quiet hum of the airplane cabin. The soft murmur of passengers settling into their seats mixed with the low rumble of the engines, creating a steady background that had always comforted her. But today, an unsettling feeling had begun to creep in, as if the very air around her carried whispers of change. She felt the weight of unspoken expectations pressing on her shoulders, and with every step, the familiar calm of routine started to crack. It began subtly. As Margaret was passing by a row of seats, she heard a low, barely audible murmur that she couldn't quite place. Leaning slightly over to listen, she caught fragments of a conversation between a couple of passengers near the back of the plane. One of them, his voice edged with irritation, remarked, "They always get special treatment, don't they? Like they're above the rules." The words sent a small ripple through the cabin, and Margaret's heart quickened. She knew well the delicate balance she was expected to maintain, a strict adherence to protocol, while also keeping the peace among those with differing opinions. Her eyes instinctively sought the source of the comment, and they fell on the quiet family she had observed earlier. The father, Malik, exchanged a brief look with his wife, Imani, a look that was difficult to decipher, a mix of calm determination and hidden sadness. Their quiet composure was a stark contrast to the rising tension in the voices around them. In that moment, Margaret's mind began to churn with doubts about whether her own actions were truly impartial or if they were tinted by something deeper, something unspoken. She resumed her work, trying to focus on the task at hand, but the earlier words continued to echo in her ears. As she made her way towards a galley to refill a cart, another comment caught her attention. A hushed remark from a passenger in a nearby seat. "I wonder why someone would treat them so differently. It's almost like someone doesn't want them here." Margaret paused, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the cool, recycled air. The remark was ambiguous, yet it hinted at hidden motives that disturbed her more than the overt displays of anger she had occasionally witnessed. Margaret's thoughts were suddenly interrupted by a minor commotion at the family's row. A small scuffle had broken out quietly, almost imperceptibly at first. It started when young Darius, no more than 8 years old, accidentally bumped into a passenger's bag while trying to retrieve a toy from his seat. The passenger, a middle-aged man with a furrowed brow, murmured his discontent under his breath. In a flash, the situation escalated as voices grew louder. Malik's calm demeanor was replaced by a quiet but firm insistence on order, and Imani's gentle tone took on an edge of controlled frustration. Margaret's hand moved to her chest unconsciously, her heartbeat quickening. She had seen many such moments during her years of service, yet something about this altercation felt different, a spark that threatened to ignite a larger conflagration. The man with the bag, his face reddening, began to raise his voice. "Don't see why you can't keep your family under control. There are rules, you know." His words, filled with disdain, cut through the murmurs of the cabin like a sudden gust of cold wind. Margaret's internal struggle deepened. She had always believed in following the rules, in the strict order that had been instilled in her from the very start of her career. But the incident before her, the quiet dignity of Malik and Amani, contrasted sharply with the raw anger of the other passenger, forced her to reconsider whether the rules were being applied fairly, or if they were being twisted by prejudice. In that moment, the carefully maintained balance of her world began to tremble. Drawing a steadying breath, Margaret approached the family's row. Her voice, when she spoke, was soft but carried an unmistakable firmness. "Sir, please calm down," she said, directing her attention to the agitated passenger. "Everything is in order here." The man's eyes narrowed, and his words became more biting. "I'm sorry, but it seems like there is a problem with you, not me. Your family is causing a disturbance." The accusation hung in the air, heavy with implications that Margaret felt seep into her very bones. Margaret's heart pounded as she struggled to keep her own emotions in check. She could sense that the situation was slipping beyond her control, that the rules she had always relied on were now clashing with something more complex and deeply rooted. In her mind, doubts mingled with the echoes of earlier comments, the whispered insinuations of favoritism, the idea that someone might have a hidden reason to see the family treated differently. It was as if the very fabric of her duty was fraying, and she was caught between the expectations of her role and the stirrings of her conscience. The tension in the cabin escalated further when another passenger, seated a few rows ahead, leaned over and muttered, "I heard that they always get a pass on everything. It's like someone behind the scenes is shielding them." The words were soft, but they resonated with a sense of conspiracy that Margaret could not ignore. Was there a secret at play here? Has someone influenced the policies that allowed the family a certain latitude? The question lingered in the back of her mind, adding a layer of betrayal to an already volatile situation. Margaret felt a sudden, unfamiliar pressure, as if the eyes of the entire cabin were fixed upon her. The quiet hum of routine was disrupted by the sharp contrast of raised voices and stifled outrage. The family, maintaining their composure, met the accusations with quiet dignity, but the strain was visible in the slight tremor of Amani's hands and the guarded set of Malik's jaw. Darius clutched a small toy tightly, and Zara's eyes darted around the cabin, as if searching for an escape from the growing storm. Unable to let the moment pass, Margaret felt compelled to act decisively. She stepped closer to the man who had initiated the confrontation, her tone now edged with a firmness that brooked no argument. "Sir, please refrain from speaking in that manner," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil churning within her. "We all have to follow the same rules on this flight." Her words, intended to restore order, instead deepened the divide that had begun to widen in the cramped space. At that moment, a subtle yet unmistakable shift occurred in the atmosphere. Margaret sensed that the disturbance was not merely a spontaneous outburst from an irate passenger. It felt orchestrated, as though someone had set the stage for this confrontation. In the reflection of the window above her, she caught a glimpse of James, her colleague, watching from a distance with an expression that was difficult to read, a mix of concern and something else, something like calculated interest. For a fleeting second, she wondered if there was more at work here than simple frustration, if hidden motives had quietly crept into this seemingly ordinary flight. The murmurs around the cabin grew louder as passengers whispered among themselves, speculating about the cause of the disturbance. Margaret's mind raced, trying to piece together the subtle hints, the offhand comments, the wary glances, and now James's unreadable expression. Was someone trying to undermine her authority? Or was it that the very structure of the rules she upheld had been compromised by influences beyond her control? The uncertainty was unsettling, and it made her question the very foundation of her professional world. As the tension reached its peak, a decision loomed before her, one that would forever alter the course of the flight and her own destiny. The angry passenger continued to hurl accusations, his voice rising as he demanded, "If your rules are so fair, why are they not applied equally to everyone? Why does your family get away with everything?" His words reverberated in the confined space, stirring a storm of emotions in both him and those who listened. Margaret's internal conflict was now at its breaking point. In her years of service, she had learned to trust in the authority of the rules, to believe that order was the foundation of safety. Yet, the evidence of hidden biases and whispered conspiracies gnawed at her resolve. Her thoughts swirled with memories of past incidents, moments when a strict adherence to protocol had blinded her to the truth of human frailty, when the very rules that were meant to protect had instead sown division. She glanced over at the family once more. Malik's calm eyes met hers for a brief moment, and in that silent exchange, Margaret felt a weight of unspoken accusation. It was not that they had broken a rule, at least not in any obvious way, but that their presence, their very dignity, was perceived as a challenge to the established order. In that instant, Margaret's uncertainty transformed into a resolve that was both painful and determined. If the rules were to be enforced, then she must do so without wavering, even if it meant confronting hidden truths that unsettled her very core. Her voice, when it emerged again, was firm yet tinged with the sorrow of inevitability. "Sir, I must insist that you respect the rules of this flight," she said, directing her attention to the man who had provoked the disturbance. "Any further disruption will force us to take action." The man's face twisted in anger, but before he could respond, a sudden, unexpected sound cut through the growing clamor, a loud clatter from the overhead compartment. All eyes turned upward as a suitcase, dislodged from its place, tumbled noisily along the aisle. In that brief moment of distraction, a wave of uncertainty swept through the cabin. Margaret's pulse quickened as she instinctively reached out to secure the runaway luggage, her mind still reeling from the charged exchange. The interruption, seemingly accidental, felt strangely timed, a coincidence that made her pause and consider the possibility of interference from forces beyond her immediate control. As the suitcase was finally recovered and stowed away, the murmurs resumed, but the earlier confrontation had now taken on a sharper edge. The whispered suspicions about hidden motives began to intertwine with the visible anger and frustration of the passengers. Margaret sensed that the incident with the overhead compartment was no mere accident. It was a symbolic reminder that the delicate order of the flight was being tampered with, that there were subtle influences working behind the scenes to unsettle the status quo. James's gaze met hers once more, and in that silent look, she saw a glimmer of something that could be read as both caution and complicity. Was he silently urging her to stand her ground, or was he, in some unspoken way, complicit in a plan that she did not fully understand? The ambiguity of his expression left her with an unsettling feeling of betrayal, an intuition that the rules she had always followed might now be manipulated by hidden agendas. The air in the cabin grew thick with tension as the minutes ticked by. Margaret felt the weight of every eye upon her, and the decision that lay before her became ever more urgent. She had to restore order, but the cost of doing so might unravel everything she believed in. The very idea that she could be forced into a role that betrayed her own sense of fairness and decency was unbearable. Yet, the rules were clear, and she had been trained to enforce them without question. In a moment of exasperated resolve, Margaret turned to the family. Her voice, though measured, carried a decisive tone. "I must ask you to remain seated and refrain from any further conduct that might be interpreted as disruptive," she said softly to Malik. Her words were not harsh, yet they were filled with an authority that brooked no disagreement. Malik's eyes, steady and calm as ever, held a quiet challenge, as if he silently communicated that he understood far more than she could imagine. Imani offered a polite nod, her expression unreadable, while Zara and Darius remained silent, their eyes wide with apprehension. As the tension in the cabin reached its peak, a subtle shift occurred in the atmosphere, a sense that the events unfolding were but the opening act of something much larger. The angry passenger's voice subsided into a frustrated mutter, and the whispered conversations among the other travelers took on a conspiratorial tone. Margaret stood at the center of it all, feeling both the pressure of her duty and the heavy burden of a truth that was just beginning to reveal itself. The subtle hints of betrayal, the offhand remarks about special treatment, and the mysterious glances exchanged among the passengers, all of these fragments began to coalesce in Margaret's mind. She realized that this incident was not merely about enforcing a rule. It was the catalyst for a deeper reckoning. A reckoning that would force her to confront not only the biases embedded in the system, but also the hidden motives that might have led to this very moment. In that charged atmosphere, Margaret felt the fragile threads of her carefully constructed world begin to unravel. Every whispered comment, every suspicious glance, hinted at a network of influences working behind the scenes, forces that were as invisible as they were powerful. The idea that someone might be orchestrating events to provoke a reaction, to unsettle the established order, was both alarming and profoundly personal. It made her question whether the loyalty she had placed in the system was misplaced, whether the rules she had so diligently enforced were being manipulated by unseen hands. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of it all. The small incident with the falling suitcase, the murmurs of special treatment, the piercing looks from colleagues and passengers alike, all of these clues seemed to point toward a betrayal that was both subtle and insidious. Margaret's heart pounded in her chest as she realized that this flight, this moment, was the turning point. The catalyst had been set in motion, and there was no turning back. In the ensuing moments, the airplane cabin became a microcosm of conflict and uncertainty. Every interaction was charged with a sense of impending change. Margaret moved from one group of passengers to another, her eyes searching for answers in the expressions of those around her. There was a palpable sense that something was hidden beneath the surface, a secret that threatened to disrupt the very foundation of trust that had always underpinned her role. The tension was no longer contained. It had spread like ripples through a still pond, reaching every corner of the cabin. With a deep, steadying breath, Margaret resolved to maintain her composure, even as her mind reeled with the implications of the unfolding events. The rules were clear, and she had been raised to believe in their absolute authority. Yet, as she looked around at the anxious faces, the subtle glances of suspicion, and the weight of unspoken words, she understood that the true challenge lay not in enforcing the rules, but in discerning the truth behind them. In that moment of decision, as the engines hum and the soft rustling of passengers formed a backdrop to the drama unfolding before her, Margaret silently vowed that she would not be a pawn in a game of hidden motives. Even as she prepared to take further action to restore order, she promised herself that she would search for the truth behind the disturbances, no matter how deeply it was buried. The delicate balance of duty and compassion, of order and fairness, had been disrupted, and it was up to her to navigate the uncertain path ahead. As the minutes turned into what felt like an eternity, the air grew heavy with the knowledge that nothing would ever be the same again. The inciting incident had shattered the fragile piece of routine, exposing the undercurrents of distrust and suspicion that had long simmered beneath the surface. Margaret's heart, once steady with the rhythm of predictable duty, now raced with the uncertainty of a future that promised both peril and the possibility of redemption. In that charged silence, Margaret's resolve hardened. She knew that the path ahead would be fraught with difficult choices that might force her to confront not only the biases of a system, but also her own hidden fears and prejudices. The betrayal, hinted at in every whispered conversation and every subtle glance, was not a distant specter, but an immediate presence, urging her to seek answers in a world that had long been governed by unquestioned authority. With one final, determined look at the family, whose eyes, calm yet defiant, met hers in a silent acknowledgement of the stakes, Margaret steeled herself for the decisions she had to make. The catalyst for change had been ignited, and as the plane continued its journey through darkening skies, she realized that the moment of truth was fast approaching. The hidden motives, the subtle betrayals, and the unspoken challenges were all converging into a single, undeniable moment of reckoning. And so, with a mixture of fear and determination swirling within her, Margaret took the first step toward a new understanding, a step that would force her to question the very rules she had upheld for so long, to look beyond the surface of duty, and to confront the shadows that lay hidden in the hearts of those around her. In that moment, The flight was no longer just a journey from one destination to another. It had become a crucible in which the fragile truths of loyalty, trust, and betrayal would be laid bare, forever altering the course of her life. As the disturbance began to settle into a tense, uneasy calm, Margaret knew that nothing would ever be as simple as it once was. The whispers of hidden motives, the hints of a betrayal lurking just beneath the surface, and the unexpected actions of those around her all pointed to a future where the lines between right and wrong were no longer clearly defined. And in that uncertain light, she vowed to search for the truth, even if it meant challenging the very foundation of the order she had once held sacred. With the engine's steady drone accompanying her thoughts, Margaret prepared herself for the inevitable storm ahead, a storm that would test not only her commitment to duty, but also her willingness to confront the complexities of a world where every rule could be questioned, and every act of loyalty might conceal a hidden betrayal. In the silent tension of that moment, as the plane soared through an ever-changing sky, Margaret embraced the realization that her life, and the lives of those around her, were on the brink of transformation, a transformation that would demand courage, compassion, and the strength to see beyond the simple labels of right and wrong. Margaret's mind was still reeling from the events of the flight as she stepped off the plane into the cool, pre-dawn air. The disturbances that had rocked the cabin continued to echo in her thoughts like a haunting refrain. As she made her way through the quiet terminal, she recalled the angry voices, the furtive glances, and the heavy undercurrent of suspicion that had seemed to bind everyone together. Now, in the solitude of the early morning, the chaos of that day began to crystallize into a deeper, more personal conflict, a descent into uncertainty that promised revelations as painful as they were transformative. That night, in the sparse light of her modest apartment, Margaret sat at her worn kitchen table with a cup of lukewarm tea. The soft hum of a distant refrigerator and the occasional creak of the old house were the only companions to her turbulent thoughts. She traced the rim of her cup with trembling fingers, remembering the moment when Malik's calm yet challenging eyes had met hers, and the way the whispered rumors of favoritism had insinuated themselves into every corner of the flight. The questions that had once been mere background noise now thundered in her mind. Had she been complicit in something larger than just enforcing routine? Had the system she trusted been rigged, with hidden motives all along? Her thoughts drifted back to the brief, intense exchange with the agitated passenger. His voice had been laced with resentment and a sense of entitlement, accusing her of partiality and bias. "Why should your rules apply differently?" he had demanded, his eyes burning with anger. Margaret had tried to keep her voice even and measured, but even as she repeated the company's policies, a tremor of uncertainty had slipped through. Now, sitting alone in the quiet of the night, she questioned whether her adherence to those same policies had blinded her to the deeper human truths that lay beneath the surface of every encounter. The next day, as the routine of her work resumed, Margaret found herself walking the familiar corridors of the airline's crew area with a heavy heart. The camaraderie among her colleagues, once a comforting constant, now felt shadowed by an unspoken tension. James, who had earlier met her gaze with that unreadable expression, approached her cautiously during a brief break. They settled into a quiet corner away from the bustle of the terminal. "Margaret," he began softly, "you seem different today. Is everything all right?" His voice was gentle but laced with genuine concern. Margaret hesitated, searching his eyes for any hint of judgment. "I don't know, James," she admitted after a pause. "Today, everything felt off. There were moments, small things, that made me question if we're really serving justice or just following orders blindly. I keep thinking, was it all manipulated? Were there hidden forces behind what happened?" James nodded slowly. "I've been noticing strange things too. Comments, glances. It feels like there's more to this than meets the eye. But it's hard to say. We're taught to trust the rules, to believe that they keep us all safe and equal. But sometimes the rules become a shackle." His words resonated with Margaret. She remembered the mentor who had once told her, "Rules guide you, but they should never blind you." The memory of that advice stung now, as if it were both a comfort and a challenge. "I've always believed in the order of things," she whispered. "But today I saw how that order can be twisted. I saw how a family, simply because of who they are, can become a symbol of both dignity and suspicion." As the day wore on, the echoes of that disturbing flight incident seemed to infiltrate every conversation. During a routine safety check in the cabin before boarding the next flight, Margaret found herself stealing glances at the black family who had been at the center of the earlier disturbance. Malik sat with a quiet composure that belied the tension in his eyes, while Imani's gentle smile hid a well of quiet resolve. Their children, Zara and little Darius, looked around with cautious curiosity, their eyes reflecting both innocence and an understanding far beyond their years. Unable to contain her thoughts any longer, Margaret approached Malik during a brief lull when he was gathering his belongings. Her voice was tentative, laden with uncertainty. "Mr. Malik, may I ask something?" she began softly. He looked at her, his eyes steady but guarded. "Of course," he replied in a measured tone. I keep wondering what happened on the flight, if there were forces at play that I never considered. I've always done my duty by the rules, but today I felt as though I was caught in a web of hidden motives. Do you ever feel that way?" His calm, measured response gave her a moment's pause to collect herself. Malik's eyes flickered for an instant before he spoke. "Sometimes," he said slowly, "when the world seems to be divided by lines that shouldn't exist, you begin to suspect that the rules themselves are written by those who wish to control us. But I choose to believe that there is a deeper strength in our unity, a strength that goes beyond the written word." His answer was simple yet profound, and in that moment, Margaret felt a spark of understanding mingled with guilt. Had she, too, been a victim of a system that allowed prejudice to masquerade as order? The conversation left Margaret with more questions than answers, but it also deepened her resolve to look within herself. That evening, after returning home, she began writing in her journal, a habit she had almost abandoned in the rush of everyday duties. The blank pages beckoned her to spill her thoughts, her doubts, and her fears in an honest stream of words. "I feel like I'm standing at the edge of something vast and unknown," she wrote, the pen scratching out the confession of a heart in turmoil. "For so long, I believed that following the rules meant doing what was right. But today, I saw how easily those rules could be manipulated to serve a purpose other than justice. I feel betrayed, not by the family, but by a system I once trusted implicitly. And now, I must confront the possibility that I have been complicit in that betrayal." As she poured her heart out onto the paper, the journal became a mirror to her soul, a place where the layers of her identity, her memories, and her ambitions intertwined. The introspection was both painful and cathartic. She recalled the early days of her career, when every flight was a promise of adventure and every passenger's smile was a reward for her service. But as the years passed, the weight of enforcing strict policies had slowly eroded the youthful optimism, replacing it with a bitter certainty that sometimes doing the right thing required questioning the rules. Over the next few days, Margaret began to notice subtle shifts in her interactions with her colleagues and passengers. The whispers of that fateful flight had spread, and while some viewed her with quiet sympathy, others regarded her with a reserved distance. In the break room, a senior crew member named Linda, a woman known for her no-nonsense attitude, approached her one afternoon. "I heard about what happened," Linda said, her tone gruff yet not unkind. "It takes courage to face the truth, even when it shakes you to your core. But remember, Margaret, sometimes we have to stand by the system until we can change it from within." Margaret looked into Linda's eyes, searching for guidance in the stern but caring expression. "But what if the system itself is flawed?" she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if following the rules means supporting injustice?" Linda paused, choosing her words carefully. "Then it is our duty to reform it. Change does not come from blind obedience, but from honest reflection and the courage to speak out." The conversation left Margaret with a renewed determination, but also a lingering sadness. She realized that reform was a long, arduous journey, one that might cost her dearly, both professionally and personally. That evening, Margaret met with James again after their shift. They found a quiet corner near the airport's small cafe, a temporary refuge from the relentless pace of their work life. "I've been thinking a lot about what Linda said," Margaret confessed, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly. "I know we're expected to follow the rules, but what if those rules are a mask for something darker?" James leaned forward, his expression earnest. "I've felt it too, Margaret. I've seen the way people treat one another, the unspoken biases that color every interaction. It's as if there is a shadow behind every policy, a hidden hand guiding our actions." His words struck a chord in her heart. They talked for hours, their conversation meandering through memories of past flights, personal regrets, and the hope for a better future. James recalled a time when he had witnessed an act of kindness that defied the rigid hierarchy of their profession, a small gesture that had illuminated the potential for compassion in even the harshest systems. "Maybe," he suggested softly, "we need to look beyond the rules and see the human being behind every decision we make. Perhaps that is where true justice lies." Margaret nodded slowly, feeling the weight of his words settle into her soul. She understood that change would not come from a single moment of rebellion, but from a series of small, courageous steps taken day by day. Yet as she listened to James, she couldn't shake the feeling that there were greater forces at work, forces that would soon force her to choose between conformity and the pursuit of truth. In the midst of these internal struggles, Margaret found herself increasingly drawn to the quiet strength of the family from the flight. Their dignity, even in the face of blatant accusation, resonated deeply with her. One day, when the opportunity presented itself during a moment of calm on a subsequent flight, she approached Imani as the family was boarding. "I wanted to thank you," Margaret said, her voice low and sincere, "for the grace with which you carried yourselves today. It reminded me that there is strength in kindness, even when the world seems set against it." Imani's eyes softened, and she offered a gentle smile. "Thank you, Margaret. Sometimes it is the quiet battles we fight that define who we are." That simple exchange left Margaret with a sense of clarity, even as the uncertainties around her deepened. Yet, as days turned into weeks, the ripple effects of that turbulent flight began to manifest in unexpected ways. Margaret started receiving anonymous notes slipped under her door at home, short messages that questioned her actions and urged her to look deeper into the system she had served for so long. One note read, "Not all is as it seems in the pursuit of order. Seek the truth beyond the surface." The cryptic words unsettled her, stirring a mix of fear and curiosity. Who was sending these messages, and what did they know about the hidden currents of power that now seemed to swirl around her? Haunted by the note, Margaret began to secretly review her own experiences, questioning every decision, every interaction that had led her to this point. The once clear lines between duty and empathy blurred into a complex tapestry of motives, regrets, and unspoken truths. Late at night, in the flickering glow of her desk lamp, she pored over her journal entries, looking for patterns in the voices of the past. There, among the honest confessions of her inner life, she found hints of a betrayal that reached far beyond the confines of a single flight incident. In one entry she had written, "I fear that the system I serve is built on a foundation of silence and compromise. The rules we follow may protect us, but they also imprison us in a cycle of unquestioning obedience." Now, those words took on new meaning. Margaret began to suspect that her journey toward understanding was only just beginning. The hidden messages, the subtle betrayals, and the quiet defiance of those around her all pointed to a larger truth, one that would force her to confront not only her own beliefs, but also the very structure of authority that governed her life. One afternoon, as Margaret prepared for another flight, she encountered a moment that crystallized her internal conflict. While performing a routine safety check, she overheard a hushed conversation between two senior crew members in a secluded corner of the terminal. Their voices were low but intense, discussing changes in company policy and a recent directive from corporate headquarters. "They want us to tighten control," one of them said, his tone grave. "But if we do that, we risk losing the trust of our passengers." The balance is already so fragile." The other crew member replied, "Sometimes, control is an illusion. The real power lies in understanding the people we serve." The conversation resonated with Margaret, reinforcing the idea that true leadership was not about rigid enforcement, but about empathy and insight. As she moved through her day, Margaret felt increasingly torn between her ingrained loyalty to the rules and the growing realization that those rules were not infallible. Every interaction became a test of her resolve, every whispered comment a challenge to her long-held beliefs. The further she delved into her own introspection, the more she began to understand that the descent she was experiencing was not a fall from grace, but a necessary step toward discovery. In questioning the very framework of her work, she was opening herself up to the possibility of transformation, a chance to redefine her role not as an enforcer of order, but as a guardian of justice. Late one evening, after a particularly exhausting day of flights and conversations that had left her emotionally raw, Margaret sat by her window, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. The night was quiet, the usual urban clamor replaced by a contemplative stillness. In that solitude, she whispered to herself, "I must find the courage to seek the truth, no matter how painful it may be." It was a vow born not out of despair, but out of the recognition that change, both personal and systemic, begins with the willingness to confront one's deepest fears. In the following days, Margaret slowly began to gather pieces of information from unexpected sources. A quiet conversation with a sympathetic colleague, a half-heard remark from a seasoned veteran of the industry, and even the cryptic notes that continued to arrive at her door. Each fragment of insight added to the mosaic of her understanding, revealing that the issues at hand were far more complex than simple rule enforcement. There were layers of history, hidden biases, and subtle manipulations that had shaped the very fabric of her work environment. Through these experiences, Margaret's inner struggles evolved into a determined quest for truth. She started to see herself not merely as a cog in the machine of routine, but as an individual with the power to influence change. Her reflections became a silent rebellion against the status quo, a personal descent into vulnerability that, paradoxically, was paving the way for discovery and renewal. One quiet morning, as the first rays of sunlight filtered through her window, Margaret sat down to write another entry in her journal. Today, she wrote, "I realize that every rule, every procedure, is only as just as the hearts of those who enforce it. I must strive to let compassion guide my actions, even when the path ahead is uncertain." The words on the page were both an admission of her past mistakes and a promise to herself, a promise to seek a deeper understanding of the world and to challenge the very foundations of the order she once upheld unquestioningly. In that moment of clarity, Margaret felt the first stirrings of hope. The descent into self-doubt and internal conflict was not the end of her journey, but the beginning of a transformation that would redefine her identity. With each new day, as she navigated the complex web of relationships and hidden agendas at work, she grew more resolute in her commitment to uncovering the truth, even if it meant standing alone against a system steeped in tradition and resistance to change. And so, as the days turned into weeks and her internal struggles deepened, Margaret embraced the descent and discovery with a quiet determination. The voices of her past, the whispered betrayals, and the raw emotions of every encounter became the stepping stones to a future where empathy and justice could prevail over blind obedience. In that ongoing journey, every conversation, every introspective moment carried the promise of transformation, a promise that she would one day emerge not as a mere enforcer of rules, but as a beacon of compassion and integrity in a world desperately in need of change. Margaret's heart pounded in her chest as she stepped into the quiet, dimly lit corridor behind the crew area. The events of the past few days had left her feeling unsettled and unsure of everything she once believed in. She had spent countless hours questioning the rules, the whispers, and the subtle hints of hidden motives that now echoed in her mind. But nothing had prepared her for what was about to be revealed. A few days after the tumultuous flight, Margaret received a formal notice summoning her to a meeting at the airline's corporate office. The note, crisp and official in tone, made no mention of the reason for the meeting, only that her presence was required. Sitting in the break room, she stared at the note over and over again, the words blurring as she tried to understand what could possibly be so important. Had her actions on that flight caught the attention of higher-ups? Or was there something more? Something that could shatter the very foundation of reality she had known? When the day arrived, Margaret found herself escorted into a small meeting room with high ceilings and large windows that allowed beams of pale light to stream in. The room was sparse, furnished with a long table and several chairs. Seated around it were two figures, Mr. Harrison, whose stern features she recognized from previous encounters, and a man she had only glimpsed during the flight, a man with a quiet presence and steady eyes. He introduced himself simply as Charles. Mr. Harrison's gaze was hard as he spoke first. "Margaret, thank you for coming. We need to discuss the events of Flight 217. His tone was measured, but carried an edge of accusation that made Margaret's stomach twist. She sat down slowly, her fingers trembling slightly as she clasped them in her lap. Margaret's mind raced with questions, but before she could speak, Charles leaned forward. "There is something you must understand," he began, his voice low and even. "The incident on Flight 217 was not merely an isolated occurrence. It has revealed truths that run much deeper than any single flight." Margaret looked from Mr. Harrison to Charles, trying to decipher the meaning behind their words. "What do you mean?" she asked softly, her voice barely audible. "I followed the rules. I did what I was trained to do." Charles's eyes softened for a moment, and he said, "Margaret, what you did that day was based on assumptions and a strict adherence to a set of rules that, in hindsight, were manipulated by forces you could not have imagined." He paused, letting the silence stretch out before continuing. "The family that you confronted, Malik, Imani, and their children, are not just passengers. They hold a position far beyond what you believed. They are the owners, the very backbone of this airline." The words hit Margaret like a tidal wave. She felt as if the floor had shifted beneath her feet. Her mind reeled, struggling to process the revelation. The family, the dignified figures who had carried themselves with quiet strength even under the weight of whispered accusations, were not simply another group of travelers. They were the ones who controlled everything, the ones who had the power to shape the rules that she had dutifully enforced. Her thoughts became a whirlwind of shock and disbelief. "That can't be true," she whispered. "You're saying that all this time I was enforcing rules against people who, in fact, own the airline." Her voice trembled, laden with both astonishment and a dawning sense of betrayal. Mr. Harrison interjected, his tone colder now. "Yes, Margaret. The policies and protocols you followed were, in part, designed to protect the interests of those in power. The family in question, under the banner of MK Enterprises, has been at the helm of this airline for over a decade." He leaned back, his eyes fixed on Margaret, as if daring her to deny the reality laid out before her. Margaret's mind flashed back to the flight, the whispered comments, the subtle glances from her colleagues, the mysterious notes that had begun appearing at her door. She recalled the moment when she had noticed James's conflicted look and Linda's cryptic words about reforming the system from within. Everything she had experienced over the past days now converged into a single, shattering truth. She had been a pawn in a game she had never known existed. "Why wasn't I told?" she asked, her voice cracking with emotion. "Why did no one warn me? I believed I was doing my job, following the rules to maintain order and fairness." Tears welled up in her eyes as she struggled with the sense of personal betrayal. It wasn't just that she had been deceived. It was that the very system she had trusted had manipulated her actions, using her as a tool to enforce a biased order. Charles's eyes held a mixture of sympathy and regret as he replied, "We understand your pain, Margaret. None of this was meant to be a personal attack against you. The rules you followed were based on long-standing practices that, over time, became distorted. Your actions, though misguided, were a reflection of a system that has allowed prejudice to hide behind the guise of order." His words, though meant to console, only deepened the sense of disillusionment in Margaret's heart. For a long, heavy moment, Silence filled the room. Margaret's thoughts were a torrent of anger, sorrow, and confusion. She felt betrayed not only by her superiors, but by the very principles she had dedicated her life to upholding. Every time she had repeated the policies, every stern command she had issued, now felt like a step further away from the truth. A memory surfaced, her earlier conversation with Malik, when she had dared to ask if he ever felt that there was more at play than just following the rules. His measured reply, hinting at the possibility that the system was designed by those in power, now rang with painful clarity. Margaret had been so certain in her duty, so committed to the idea of order, that she had never questioned the source of those rules. And now, confronted with this revelation, she felt as though the ground beneath her had crumbled. "I trusted the system," she murmured, her voice laden with disbelief. "I believed that following the rules meant doing what was right, but now I see. I was blind. I was enforcing a system that was built to serve a select few." The weight of her words hung in the air, each syllable a confession of her own complicity in a flawed order. Mr. Harrison's expression remained impassive, yet there was a hint of something unspoken in his eyes, a regret that perhaps even he had not fully escaped the moral quagmire. "The system has always been complex, Margaret," he said slowly. "There are layers of power and influence that most of us never see. Your actions on that flight were a product of everything you had been taught. It is not your fault that the policies were used to mask deeper biases." But Margaret could not accept that. The betrayal cut too deeply. In the days leading up to this moment, she had wrestled with her doubts, questioned the whispers of hidden agendas, and even dared to imagine that the rules might be manipulated. Now, faced with undeniable proof that the very family she had reprimanded held the reins of power, she felt an overwhelming surge of disillusionment. Every moment of her service, the countless hours spent ensuring that every passenger followed the same protocols, seemed tainted by this new knowledge. Her mind flashed back to the anonymous notes that had been left for her at home. "Seek the truth beyond the surface," one had read. At the time, those words had sparked a cautious curiosity, but now they resonated with a painful irony. The truth had been hidden in plain sight all along, and she had been too blinded by routine to see it. Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she looked from one face to another in the room. "How can I ever go back to doing my job the same way?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Every time I enforce a rule, every time I correct a passenger, I will remember that I have been part of something unjust. I feel used. I feel betrayed by everything I once believed in." Charles leaned forward again, his tone gentle yet firm. "This is not the end, Margaret. What you feel now, the pain, the disillusionment, is the beginning of a journey toward understanding. You have been given a glimpse behind the curtain. It is painful, yes, but it is also an opportunity to change the system from within." His words were meant to offer a lifeline, a way to transform betrayal into something constructive. But the betrayal was too fresh, too raw. Margaret's mind churned with the memories of the flight, the subtle hints that had pointed to a hidden reality. She thought of the moment when the angry passenger had shouted, "Your rules are not fair," and how she had replied, trying to maintain order without questioning the fairness of the system. Now, every word she had spoken felt like a lie. She had been upholding a system that was built on a foundation of exclusion and bias. In that meeting room, as the afternoon light slanted through the windows, Margaret felt as though she were caught between two worlds. On one side was the familiar structure of duty and protocol, the very core of her professional identity. On the other was a harsh, unsettling reality that revealed how that structure was compromised by the ambitions and prejudices of those in power. The revelation that the family was not just another group of passengers, but the owners of the airline tore at the fabric of her understanding, leaving her raw and exposed. Her thoughts turned inward, and she began to question every moment of her career. Has she always been too rigid in her approach? Had her unquestioning loyalty to the rules blinded her to the human suffering that lay beneath? Each memory, every recollection of a time when she had dismissed a subtle act of kindness or a quiet plea for understanding, now felt like a missed opportunity, a chance to act with compassion rather than with blind adherence. A deep sense of betrayal welled up inside her as she recalled the faces of those she had served. Every passenger's story, every quiet exchange of smiles or frowns, was now tinted with the realization that the system she had trusted was nothing more than a facade for maintaining power and control. The personal cost of her actions, of following orders without questioning, was now laid bare before her. The revelation had not only shifted her view of the airline, but had shattered her perception of herself as a fair and just person. Margaret's eyes wandered to Mr. Harrison, whose expression now conveyed a mixture of pity and resignation. "I wish you had known sooner," he said softly, as if speaking to himself more than to her. "None of us did. The truth was hidden behind layers of tradition and secrecy. But now you have a choice: to continue down the path of unquestioning obedience, or to use this knowledge to bring about change." For a long moment, silence reigned as Margaret absorbed his words. The sense of betrayal was profound, and the emotional intensity of the moment was almost too much to bear. She felt as though she were standing at the edge of a precipice, with the possibility of redemption on one side and the abyss of regret on the other. Her mind filled with doubts about her future, about whether she could ever reclaim the integrity she once thought she possessed. At last, with a trembling sigh, Margaret spoke. "I need time," she said, her voice quiet but resolute. "I need to understand what this means for me, what it means for all of us who have been living under these rules." Her eyes met Charles's, and in that gaze, she saw both understanding and an unspoken challenge. The path ahead would not be easy. It would be paved with the difficult task of confronting the system, of exposing the biases and hidden agendas that had corrupted it. As she left the meeting room, the weight of the revelation pressed down on her like a physical burden. Outside, the world continued its usual rhythm, oblivious to the turmoil raging inside her. The familiar sights of the airport, the orderly lines of passengers, the hum of conversations, the soft glow of neon signs, now seemed alien. Each step she took was laden with the realization that nothing would ever be the same again. In the days that followed, Margaret's inner world underwent a profound transformation. The revelation of the family's true identity stirred a storm of emotions within her, a mix of anger, sorrow, and a desperate need for redemption. Every encounter with colleagues and passengers became a reminder of her own complicity, and every rule she once enforced now carried the bitter taste of betrayal. Late at night, when the world was quiet and her thoughts were her only companions, Margaret would sit by her window and replay the meeting in her mind. The voices of Mr. Harrison and Charles echoed in her ears, challenging her to see beyond the surface of duty and to embrace the painful truth. In those solitary hours, she began to write fervently in her journal, pouring out her anguish and her newfound resolve. She wrote about the cruelty of a system that masked injustice with the veneer of order, about the betrayal of a profession she once revered, and about the desperate need to rebuild her identity on a foundation of truth and compassion. In one entry she confessed, "I feel lost in the aftermath of this revelation. I was a faithful servant of a system I believed in, only to discover that it was built on secrets and lies. Now, I stand at a crossroads, betrayed by the very rules that were meant to protect us. I must find a way to rise above this, to turn my disillusionment into a force for change." Her words, raw and unfiltered, became a catalyst for a slow, painful transformation. Margaret began to reach out to those who had once seemed distant. A quiet conversation with a sympathetic colleague here, a gentle word exchanged with a passenger who had suffered silently there. With each act of kindness, she tried to atone for the rigidity of her past, hoping to mend the fractures in her own soul and in the system that had once defined her. In the midst of this internal revolution, Margaret discovered that the anonymous notes were not the only messages challenging the status quo. A trusted friend from her early days on the job, someone who had long harbored quiet doubts about the system, revealed to her that the truth was known to a small, clandestine group within the airline. They had observed the same injustices and were quietly working to expose the corruption hidden within the policies. This knowledge, though shared in hushed tones and secret meetings, gave Margaret a glimmer of hope. She was not alone in her struggle. There were others who recognized that the system needed to change. The days turned into weeks as Margaret wrestled with her feelings of betrayal and the urgent need to redefine her purpose. The revelation that the family she had once treated as mere troublemakers were in fact the powerful owners of the airline shattered her previous worldview, but it also opened the door to possibility she had never dared to imagine, a chance to transform the very nature of her work. The burden of guilt and disillusionment, though heavy, began to fuel a quiet determination. She realized that by embracing the truth, however painful, she might finally be able to break free from the chains of unquestioning obedience. Standing on the precipice of a new beginning, Margaret made a silent vow to herself. She would no longer be defined by the rigid rules of a corrupted system. Instead, she would strive to uncover the truth behind every policy, to question every order, and to forge a path where fairness and compassion reigned. The journey ahead promised to be fraught with challenges and setbacks, but for the first time in her life, she felt that the struggle was worth undertaking. As the morning light broke through the darkness of her despair, Margaret stepped out into the world with a new sense of purpose. Every interaction, every whispered conversation in the corridors of the airline now carried the weight of her commitment to change. The revelation of the hidden power behind the family had been a betrayal, yes, but it had also been a turning point, a moment when she realized that the only way to mend a broken system was to first confront the lies that had sustained it. In that bittersweet dawn, Margaret resolved to rewrite her own story, to transform her disillusionment into a driving force for justice. And though the pain of betrayal would linger like a scar, it would serve as a constant reminder of the importance of questioning the status quo and fighting for a world where every rule was born of truth rather than manipulation. With each new day, Margaret carried the lessons of that fateful revelation in her heart. She knew that the road ahead would be steep and uncertain, but she also understood that only by embracing the full spectrum of her emotions, anger, sorrow, hope, could she truly find redemption. And so, as she walked through the familiar halls of the airline once more, a quiet determination shone in her eyes, a promise that she would never again allow herself to be blinded by routine, but would instead seek the truth with every step she took. In the end, the twist of fate had not broken her. It had, in fact, awakened a deeper understanding of herself and the world she had long taken for granted. And in that painful, disillusioning moment of betrayal, Margaret discovered a spark of a revolution, one that began with the courage to question, to feel, and ultimately to change. Margaret woke before dawn with a heaviness in her chest that made every breath feel labored. The revelation from that meeting still burned in her mind. How the family she had scolded on the flight was not only innocent of any misconduct, but, in fact, the very force behind the airline's rulemaking. That knowledge had shattered the foundation of everything she had believed in. Now, in the dim light of early morning, as she sat alone in her modest apartment, the silence around her only served to amplify the tumult of thoughts swirling inside. She reached for the small, folded note that had arrived that night, its message still echoing in her mind. The truth is deeper than the rules. Not all betrayals are visible. The words had been written in a hand that she did not recognize, yet they resonated with a truth she was desperate to understand. With trembling fingers, she unfolded the note once more and read it slowly, each word intensifying the inner conflict that had already taken root. Was it a warning, a promise, or perhaps another deception meant to further entangle her in a web of hidden motives? Determined to find some semblance of clarity, Margaret decided to visit the small cafe near the crew area at the airport, a place where she had once felt safe in the company of colleagues and friends. The walk there was unusually long, as if the corridors of the terminal had grown larger and more oppressive with each step she took. Her thoughts churned relentlessly. How many layers of betrayal could there be? How deep did the corruption run? And most painfully, who could she trust when the very system she had devoted her life to was steeped in deception. Inside the cafe, the low hum of conversation and the rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee did little to ease her anxiety. She spotted James seated in a quiet corner, his expression somber as he sipped his tea. His eyes met hers with a mixture of sympathy and something that Margaret could not immediately place. Was it concern, or perhaps a hint of regret? Taking a seat opposite him, she hesitated before speaking. "James, I need know. Did you ever suspect that there was more to all of this? That the rules we follow aren't just about keeping order, but about serving someone else's interests?" Her voice was low and hesitant, as if she feared that even the act of questioning might invite further pain. James's gaze flickered away momentarily, and when he looked back, his eyes were filled with a troubled honesty. "I did wonder," he admitted softly. "For a long time I noticed little things, a comment here, a look there, that made me question the integrity of what we do. But I never thought it could go as deep as this." He paused, searching for the right words. "Margaret, I have always admired your commitment to fairness. That's why it hurts to see you caught in this spiral. I want to help you, but I'm afraid I might not have been completely honest with you either." The words hung between them, charged with a tension that made Margaret's heart beat faster. "What do you mean?" she asked, leaning in as if trying to capture every nuance of his confession. James sighed, his fingers drumming against the rim of his cup. "There have been discussions, quiet ones, about how we should handle situations like what happened on Flight 217. I was approached by someone from the corporate world last month. They asked me to keep an eye on you, to monitor your actions. They said that your recent behavior, your questioning of our procedures, was becoming a liability. I didn't want to believe it at first, but now I'm not so sure." Margaret's stomach twisted into a knot. The idea that someone she trusted might be complicit in watching her every move, that her internal struggles were being exploited, was almost too much to bear. "You mean you've been spying on me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. James's eyes filled with regret. "I never wanted to hurt you, Margaret. I was caught in a position where I had no choice. They promised that it would be temporary, that once everything was sorted out, I wouldn't have to be involved anymore. But I see now that it was a mistake. I'm so sorry." The weight of his confession added another layer of betrayal to an already overwhelming sense of disillusionment. Margaret felt as if the world around her was crumbling, every familiar face now a potential enemy. The thought that even those closest to her might have been working against her made her question the very nature of trust. As their conversation ended in a heavy silence, Margaret excused herself and left the cafe. The corridors of the terminal now seemed even more oppressive, the fluorescent lights overhead casting harsh shadows that twisted and contorted in her vision. Every step she took was laden with a sense of foreboding, as though the walls themselves were closing in around her. Over the next few days, the tension within the airline grew palpably. Whispers circulated among the crew about recent changes in policy, and more anonymous notes began to appear. Some threatening, others cryptic, all hinting at a conspiracy far larger than Margaret had ever imagined. One note read, "Trust is a luxury you can no longer afford. Look within, but be wary of those who smile too warmly." Each message deepened her internal spiral, forcing her to confront not only the betrayal by corporate powers, but also the erosion of her own self-trust. In the midst of this escalating chaos, Linda, a seasoned crew member known for her forthright manner, called Margaret into her small office at the crew lounge. Linda's usually steady eyes now held an edge of urgency. "Margaret, I need to speak with you," she said, her tone leaving no room for misinterpretation. "There are matters at hand that you should be aware of, matters that may complicate your understanding of what's really happening here." Margaret listened intently as Linda explained that a new directive had been issued by corporate headquarters, a directive that would give management even broader authority over flight operations and disciplinary actions. "They're saying it's for safety," Linda said bitterly. "But I know you as well as anyone here. I know that it's really about control. They want to silence any dissent before it grows too loud." Margaret's mind raced. The layers of deception were multiplying, each one more insidious than the last. "But why me, Linda? Why am I the one caught in all of this? She asked, her voice trembling with both anger and despair. Linda hesitated, then spoke softly. Because you began to question the system. Because you dared to look behind the facade. And because, unfortunately, once you see the truth, there's no going back. Her eyes softened with pity. I wish I could tell you that there's still a way out, that we can change things together. But be warned, there are forces at work that will do everything in their power to keep the status quo intact. That evening, as Margaret sat at her kitchen table once more, the spiraling cascade of betrayal and deception pressed upon her like a physical weight. Her journal lay open before her, and she began to write furiously, her pen scratching out the raw emotions that surged within her. I feel like I am drowning in a sea of lies, she wrote. Every person I trusted, every rule I once believed in, now seems tainted by ulterior motives. The world I knew has been shattered, and I am left to pick up the pieces while the ones who broke it stand unrepentant. The words blurred as tears welled in her eyes, and she found herself questioning not only the external structures that had betrayed her, but also the internal voice that had once guided her with such unwavering conviction. The conflict was no longer simply about enforcing rules. It had become a battle for her very identity. She was caught in a spiral, a descent into a reality where every action, every whispered conversation, was fraught with hidden dangers and the threat of further betrayal. In the days that followed, Margaret tried to regain control of her life, but the spiral only tightened its grip. On a routine flight a few days later, she found herself hypervigilant. Every interaction weighed against the possibility of deceit. She noticed how some passengers exchanged furtive glances, as if communicating secrets in a language only they understood. Even her colleagues' smiles seemed forced, their eyes flickering with an unreadable mixture of solidarity and suspicion. The external world had become a mirror of her internal chaos. During one such flight, a seemingly trivial incident further escalated her inner turmoil. A passenger, visibly agitated, began loudly complaining about a delay in service, accusing the cabin crew of favoritism and incompetence. Margaret intervened with her customary calm, but as she did so, she caught a glimpse of a familiar face in the crowd, a face that sent a jolt through her system. It was a man she had seen only once before, standing near the back of the plane, his eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made her blood run cold. For a fleeting moment, their gazes met, and in that brief encounter, Margaret felt as if the man was silently accusing her of complicity in a far greater betrayal. She couldn't shake the feeling that he knew more about the hidden machinations than anyone else on board. After a flight, in the quiet isolation of the crew area, Margaret sought out this man. When she found him, he introduced himself only as Aaron, his voice low and measured. "I'm sorry to intrude," he began, "but I think you deserve to know the full extent of what's happening." His words, spoken with an urgency that mirrored her own inner conflict, compelled her to listen. Aaron explained that he had been a part of a clandestine group within the airline, a group that had been gathering evidence of corruption and abuse of power for years. However, as he revealed, there was a schism within the group. Some members had chosen to protect the corrupt system in exchange for their own power, while others had remained committed to genuine reform. "The system you've been fighting against," Aaron said quietly, "is even more tangled than you realize. The directives from corporate, the anonymous notes, even the monitoring by your colleagues, none of it is random. It's all part of a larger plan to consolidate control and silence those who dare to question." His eyes bore into hers, and in that moment, Margaret felt both vindicated and betrayed all over again. Here was someone who confirmed that her suspicions were real, yet his presence also added another layer of complexity to her struggle. Aaron warned her that her actions and her growing disillusionment had not gone unnoticed. "They're watching you, Margaret," he said urgently. "And if you continue down this path, you'll become a target. Not just of corporate's wrath, but of those within our own ranks who have sold out to maintain their positions." The revelation struck her hard. She was caught not only between her personal ideals and the corrupt system, but also within a network of colleagues whose loyalties were anything but clear. In the following days, as the pressure mounted both externally and within her own heart, Margaret began to realize that the spiral of betrayal was far from over. Every new piece of information, every whispered secret, deepened the complexity of her choices. The internal conflict that had started as a quiet questioning of the rules had erupted into a full-blown crisis of identity and purpose. She was forced to ask herself, who was she, if not someone who believed in fairness? And what did it mean to stand by her values when every corner of her world was tainted by deception? At work, the atmosphere became increasingly charged. The new directive from corporate, designed to tighten control over flight operations, sparked protests and hushed discussions among the crew. Margaret found herself at the center of these tensions. Some colleagues urged her to conform, to forget her doubts, and return to the safety of routine. Others, like a few younger attendants who still believed in the possibility of change, rallied around her in quiet solidarity. But even among those who seemed to support her, Margaret could sense an undercurrent of fear, the fear of retribution from a system that would not tolerate dissent. One evening, as she was leaving the terminal after a particularly grueling shift, Margaret was confronted by a shadowy figure in the dim light of the parking lot. The figure's voice was soft yet insistent. "You must be careful, Margaret. There are those who would see you destroyed if you continue to dig too deep." The warning, delivered without any further explanation, sent a chill down her spine. Was it a threat? A warning from a rival faction within the airline? Or perhaps another betrayal from someone she had once trusted? The ambiguity of the message only deepened her sense of isolation. Back in her apartment that night, with the city lights flickering outside her window like distant beacons of hope, Margaret sat down at her desk and tried once more to piece together the fragments of her crumbling reality. The notes, the whispered conversations, Aaron's revelation, and now this latest threat, all of it wove together into a tapestry of deception that left her reeling. She wrote furiously in her journal, her thoughts a chaotic blend of anger, fear, and a desperate longing for truth. "I am caught in a spiral," she wrote, "one that pulls me ever deeper into a maze of lies and betrayals. Each step I take only reveals more questions than answers. How can I stand by my principles when every face I see might hide a dagger?" The next day, determined to confront her inner demons and the external forces arrayed against her, Margaret resolved to take action. She arranged a secret meeting with a small group of colleagues whom she believed still held onto their ideals. In a quiet corner of a rarely used lounge at the airport, she shared her discoveries and fears. "I know it sounds crazy," she said, her voice trembling with both passion and uncertainty, "but I believe we are being set up. Our actions, our doubts, everything is being monitored and manipulated. We have to stand together if we're going to have any hope of changing things." The meeting was tense, and while a few faces showed nods of agreement, others remained unreadable, their loyalty uncertain. One young attendant, eyes wide with both fear and determination, asked, "What can we do, Margaret? If we resist, we risk everything. Our jobs, our safety." Her words struck a chord deep within Margaret, who knew full well that every choice now came at a cost. "I don't have all the answers," she replied, "but I do know that silence is no longer an option. We must find a way to expose the truth, even if it means risking everything." As the days wore on, the pressure grew unbearable. The airline's management began to clamp down harder on any signs of dissent. Margaret found herself under constant surveillance, her every move seemingly scrutinized by unseen eyes. The internal conflicts that had once been private were now public, fueling rumors and stoking the flames of rebellion among the crew. Every whispered conversation, every furtive glance in the hallways, served as a reminder that she was alone in a battle that was becoming increasingly dangerous. Then, just when Margaret thought the spiral could not tighten any further, another betrayal struck from within. One evening, as she was reviewing a series of encrypted emails on her laptop, emails that she believed contained evidence of the corruption festering within the airline, she received a message that made her blood run cold. The sender was unknown, but the content was unmistakable. It was a warning, urging her to cease her investigations immediately and promising dire consequences if she did not comply. The tone was cold and merciless, leaving no room for negotiation. Margaret's hands trembled as she read the message, the words searing themselves into her mind. She knew then that the forces against her were not only powerful but ruthless. That night, sleep eluded her. Every creak in her apartment, every distant sound in the dark, made her feel as though she were surrounded by enemies. The spiral of betrayal and deception had reached a critical point, and Margaret could no longer ignore the escalating urgency of the conflict. The choices before her were stark and painful: to continue her quest for truth and risk complete ruin, or to retreat into silence and let the corruption go unchallenged. In the early hours of the morning, as the first light of dawn crept through her window, Margaret made a decision. Despite the fear, despite the overwhelming sense of isolation and betrayal, she resolved that she would not allow herself to be crushed by the weight of the system's lies. With a newfound determination, she began to gather all the evidence she could find, compiling her journal entries, the anonymous notes, and the accounts of those few colleagues who had dared to speak out. Each piece of evidence was a small rebellion, a spark of hope in the darkness of deception. Standing at the precipice of a future fraught with danger, Margaret realized that her journey had transformed her. The woman who had once believed in the simple fairness of rules had been forged anew by the fires of betrayal and disillusionment. The spiral had drawn her into depths of despair, but it had also awakened in her a fierce resolve to challenge the corrupt forces that sought to control her world. As she prepared to take the next step, a step that would lead her deeper into the heart of the conspiracy, Margaret knew that her path would be perilous. Yet, in that peril, she also saw the possibility of redemption. The layers of deception, the betrayals from those she once trusted, and the relentless pressure of an oppressive system would all be laid bare. And with every truth uncovered, she would reclaim a piece of herself that had been lost in the spiral. In the coming days, as the tension within the airline reached a fever pitch, Margaret moved forward with a quiet urgency. Every decision, every action, was weighed against the cost of silence versus the price of truth. The spiral had not broken her. It had transformed her into someone who would no longer be complicit in injustice. And though the road ahead was uncertain, filled with shadows and hidden dangers, she knew that she must forge a path toward a future where fairness and compassion could finally triumph over betrayal and deception. In that bittersweet moment of resolve, as Margaret stepped out into the harsh light of day, she carried with her the scars of her struggles and the promise of a revolution born not of violence, but of the courage to question, to defy, and ultimately, to rebuild a world where every rule was founded on truth rather than manipulation. And so, with every step, the spiral of conflict and betrayal continued to twist and turn around her, urging her ever onward into the unknown, where only the brave dared to tread. Margaret stepped into the stark, fluorescent-lit conference room with a trembling resolve. The air was thick with tension and the unmistakable scent of cold metal and stale coffee. Every footstep echoed against the hard, polished floor as she made her way to the long, imposing table at the center of the room, a table that, for years, had served as the altar upon which the airline's secrets and power were quietly negotiated. Now, it would bear witness to the unmasking of all that had been hidden. Her eyes, still swollen from the torrent of emotions of recent days, met those of Mr. Harrison, whose expression was inscrutable behind the veneer of corporate detachment. Flanking him were representatives from the board, their faces a mix of regret and defiance, and, to Margaret's dismay, a familiar figure from her past, Aaron, whose solemn eyes now held a new depth of sorrow and determination. Seated at the far end of the table was a man with an air of quiet authority, his presence confirming what she had learned in whispered conversations. He was the voice of the family behind Airline, the very owners whose identity had shattered her beliefs. A heavy silence fell over the room. The only sounds were the soft whir of the air conditioning and the measured ticking of a wall clock. Margaret's heart pounded in her chest as she gripped the arms of her chair, trying to steady herself against the storm of betrayal and disillusionment that raged inside her. "Margaret," Mr. Harrison began, his tone clipped yet carrying an undercurrent of urgency, "we are gathered here today because the events surrounding Flight 217 and the subsequent revelations have reached a critical point. It is time for all truths to be laid bare." Margaret's voice trembled as she spoke. "All my life, I believed in the rules meant to protect and to uphold fairness. I trusted that by following them, I was serving justice. But now I see that those rules were crafted to serve a select few. I was nothing more than a pawn in a system built on lies." Her words resonated in the still air. The room seemed to shrink, as if the very walls were closing in to bear witness to her pain. Across the table, the owner's representative, a man named Malik, leaned forward. His voice was steady and calm, belying the gravity of the situation. "Margaret, I understand your anger and your hurt. Our family has worked for decades to keep this airline afloat. Yet, the system you enforced was designed not solely to protect, but to consolidate power. It is not your fault that the rules were used to marginalize those who did not fit a certain mold." Margaret's eyes flashed with a mixture of sorrow and indignation. "You expect me to accept that the very principles I believed in were manipulated? That I contributed to a system of exclusion without ever knowing?" Her voice grew louder, reverberating off the cold, hard surfaces. "How can I ever trust what I once held sacred?" Aaron, who had stood quietly until now, stepped forward. His presence, once a source of tentative support, now cut through the room like a sharpened blade. "Margaret, there is another truth that must be told," he said, his tone low and weighted with remorse. "Not only were you misled by the policies of this airline, but those closest to you, those you believed were your allies, have been complicit in maintaining this deceit. I know that you were monitored, that even James, someone you trusted, was forced to betray your confidence." His words hung in the air, deepening the sense of isolation that had been building in Margaret's chest. Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she struggled to comprehend the magnitude of the betrayal. The knowledge that every step she had taken in faithful service might have been orchestrated by unseen hands was almost too much to bear. "I gave my all to uphold what I thought was right," she whispered, voice cracking. "I believed I was making a difference. And now I learned that I was just a cog, an instrument in their grand design." A murmur rose from around the table, a mix of sympathy and uneasy acknowledgement. Mr. Harrison cleared his throat before continuing. "Margaret, we are not here to assign personal blame. The corruption runs deep within the very structure of this organization. You are a victim of a system that has allowed personal biases and hidden agendas to dictate policy. But now, as we stand at this crossroads, we have a choice. We can continue to live under the pretense of order, or we can work to rebuild a system that truly values justice and compassion." The intensity in the room was palpable. The harsh fluorescent lights seemed to illuminate every line of worry on Margaret's face, every flicker of pain in her eyes. She recalled the countless moments of internal struggle, the late nights spent poring over her journal, the secret meetings with like-minded colleagues, the anonymous notes that had both warned and tormented her. All of those moments had led her here, to this climactic confrontation where every lie would be laid to rest. "Rebuild the system?" Margaret repeated, her voice trembling with both anger and a desperate hope. "How do you expect me to trust anything after all this? How do you expect me to trust you when every action, every decision, was designed to keep me in the dark?" Malik's gaze softened as he responded, "I cannot ask you to forgive Margaret, nor can I undo the harm that has been done. But I can assure you that the truth is now in the open. Our family has long struggled against the tides of prejudice and control, just as you have. We too have been betrayed by a system that values power over people. Today, we must stand together if we are to forge a new path." The air vibrated with the weight of his words. Margaret felt the stirrings of a fragile hope, mingled with the raw, searing pain of betrayal. She looked around the table, at Mr. Harrison, whose stern facade now seemed to waver under the burden of his own complicity, at Aaron, whose eyes were filled with a sincere remorse, and at Malik, whose calm dignity was a stark contrast to the chaos in her heart. Each face represented a facet of the very system she had once served, now laid bare in all its complexity. As the confrontation reached its fevered pitch, voices began to overlap in a torrent of revelations. Another board member, her voice quavering with a mixture of defiance and regret, spoke up. "We have seen the evidence of how our policies have been skewed. We have watched as loyalty was measured not by merit, but by willingness to conform. And we have seen how dissent is punished. It is time we admit that the order we once believed in is a lie." The room seemed to pulse with a rhythm of confessions and revelations. Margaret felt as though she were in the eye of a storm, a center where the violent winds of truth and betrayal swirled around her, threatening to tear her apart even as they promised a chance at redemption. The sensory details of the moment were overwhelming, the stifling heat of the room contrasting sharply with the cool, clinical brightness of the overhead lights, the clatter of chairs as someone shifted uncomfortably, the low hum of the air conditioner that did little to dispel the oppressive atmosphere. Margaret's mind raced as she attempted to reconcile the many truths that were colliding before her. She remembered the quiet moments on the flight, the subtle signals of dissent from her colleagues, the hushed warnings from anonymous sources. All of it now converged in this room, where every secret, every lie, was being stripped away. "What do I do now?" she asked, her voice barely audible amid the rising din of confession. "How do I rebuild trust when everything I believed in has been exposed as a sham?" Mr. Harrison's eyes, once so cold and unyielding, now brimmed with a reluctant empathy. "You do what you always did, Margaret," he said slowly, "by questioning, by seeking the truth, even when it hurts. You have the power to change this system from within, to make it accountable to the very people it was meant to serve. It starts with acknowledging the darkness that has clouded our judgment, and then daring to step into the light." Margaret's gaze shifted to Aaron, whose solemn face reflected both the scars of betrayal and a cautious optimism. "I have seen too much to believe that we can simply go back to the way things were," he said quietly. "But I also know that surrendering to despair is not an option. Every moment of doubt, every painful revelation, has brought us closer to understanding the true nature of our struggle. We must use this moment, this climax of our conflict, as a turning point." The words resonated deeply with Margaret. In that instant, she felt as though she were standing on the precipice of a new beginning. The room, with its harsh lights and echoing voices, became a crucible in which the raw materials of her past, the pain, the betrayal, the shattered ideals, were being melted down and recast into something stronger, something that might yet lead to redemption. As the meeting wore on, the conversation shifted from accusations to plans for the future. Discussions turned to the possibility of reforming the airline's policies, of creating a framework that truly valued fairness over blind obedience. Margaret listened as her colleagues debated the practical steps needed to dismantle the old order and rebuild from its ruins. Every suggestion, every new idea, was infused with the hope that from the chaos of betrayal, a new, more honest system could emerge. Margaret felt a stirring of resolve deep within her. The confrontation, with all its pain and intensity, had stripped away the illusions that had long obscured her vision. In their place was a clear, if painful, understanding of the forces that had manipulated her and the others. "I have spent so long enforcing rules that I never questioned their origin," she said, her voice steadier now. "But no more. I want to be part of the solution, to help create a system where truth, compassion, and justice are not sacrificed at the altar of power." Her declaration was met with a silence that was at once heavy and expectant. In that silence, each person in the room seemed to feel the weight of their own complicity and the promise of change. The fluorescent lights above, the cold gleam of polished surfaces, and the echoing tick of the clock all merged into a single, sensory-rich reminder that time was both an enemy and an ally, a force that could either bury the truth or reveal it, if only one had the courage to act. Margaret's eyes met those of Malik once again. In his steady, unwavering gaze, she saw not an adversary, but a fellow traveler on a perilous road. "I am willing to stand up, to fight for a system that honors every human life," she said, her voice filled with a newfound determination, "even if it means risking everything I have known." The owner's representative nodded slowly, his expression softening with a mixture of respect and understanding. "Then let this moment mark the beginning of our true journey," he said. "No more secrets, no more deceptions. Let us work together to rebuild trust where it has been broken, to forge a path where accountability is not a burden, but a shared responsibility." As the room gradually emptied, the aftershocks of the confrontation lingering in the quiet hum of the now empty space, Margaret remained seated at the table for several long moments. The echoes of the day's revelations reverberated in her mind, the taste of bitter betrayal, the sharp sting of tears, and yet the gentle warmth of a hope rekindled. Outside, the building's large windows offered a glimpse of the fading daylight, the sky painted in hues of deep purple and gold, a reminder that even in darkness, there is the promise of dawn. Walking slowly out of the conference room, Margaret paused in the corridor, feeling the cool touch of a marble wall beneath her fingertips. Every sound, the distant murmur of voices, the soft hum of the ventilation system, seemed amplified, as if the building itself was aware of the monumental shift that had just occurred. In that moment, she allowed herself a quiet reflection. The journey had been long and painful, filled with spirals of betrayal and moments of dizzying despair, but now she understood that every tear shed, every moment of doubt, had led her to this singular truth, that only by facing the darkness head-on could one hope to reclaim the light. With each step toward the exit, Margaret felt the weight of the past lifting, replaced by the fragile promise of transformation. The truths that had been revealed in that heated, sensory-rich confrontation were not an end, but a beginning, a starting point for a long, arduous process of rebuilding not only the airline system, but also her own shattered sense of self. The moral reflection that accompanied the climax was as raw as it was essential. To honor the truth, one must be willing to sacrifice comfort, to risk isolation, and to accept that the journey toward justice is paved with hardship. As she stepped out into the cool evening air, Margaret took a deep breath, feeling the crisp night wind wash over her like a cleansing balm. The stars above shone with an unyielding clarity, each one a beacon of hope in the vast, dark sky. In that moment of solitude and clarity, she promised herself that she would carry forward the lessons of this day, lessons of resilience, truth, and the unbreakable spirit of those who dare to question authority. In the silence of that final moment, before the night fully embraced the city, Margaret closed her eyes and let herself feel the truth of her own transformation. The confrontation, with all its emotional intensity and sensory overload, had not destroyed her. It had freed her. And in that freedom lay the power to rebuild not only a corrupt system, but also the very foundations of her own soul. With a determined heart and a mind brimming with hard-won wisdom, Margaret set forth into the uncertain night. Every step was a step toward redemption, every breath a defiant act of hope. And as the cold night air mingled with the lingering warmth of the revelations, she knew that the future, however fraught with challenges, held the promise of a world where truth and compassion finally triumphed over the shadows of deception and betrayal. Margaret lingered in the cool silence of the now empty conference room long after the final words had faded. The heated confrontation, the raw, painful unveiling of secrets and betrayals, still pulsed within her like a persistent drumbeat. As she slowly rose from the chair at which she had poured out her soul, every step toward the door felt weighted with the gravity of a truth too immense to fully grasp. The fluorescent lights above cast long, stark shadows that danced along the polished floor, mirroring the tumult that swirled within her. In that quiet moment of aftermath, the air itself seemed to thicken with the residue of confessions and the bitter tang of accountability. Outside, the corridor was dimly lit by the soft glow of emergency lights, their red hues mingling with the waning daylight that filtered in through high, narrow windows. Each step that Margaret took was deliberate, as if the very act of walking could stitch together the fragmented pieces of her identity. She paused in the hall, closing her eyes briefly to steady her racing heart and let the silence of the building seep into her bones. The echoes of voices from moments before, the pleading, the accusatory, and the resigned murmurs, reverberated like ghosts in her mind, urging her to confront not only the external corruption of the system, but also the deep fissures within her own soul. In the stillness of that long corridor, Margaret felt the weight of the confrontation begin to ease, replaced slowly by a cautious clarity. She recalled the intense expressions on the faces of her colleagues, Mr. Harrison's guarded regret, Aaron's earnest sorrow, and Malik's calm yet somber dignity. Their words had struck chords inside her, chords that vibrated with both the agony of betrayal and the promise of a possibility for renewal. Now, with the meeting behind her, the finality of the moment was giving way to a new, uncharted phase of reckoning. Stepping out into the open air of the airport's back entrance, Margaret was met by the cool embrace of the evening. The twilight sky stretched out in a tapestry of deep indigo and soft lavender, the last vestiges of sunlight fading behind the distant skyline. The night air carried a subtle chill, whispering of change and the promise of beginnings. In that brief, fleeting moment, she allowed herself to breathe in the cool air, feeling it wash over her like a gentle balm that soothed the raw edges of her wounded spirit. She began to walk slowly along the deserted sidewalk leading to the parking area. Each step echoed softly on the pavement, and the rhythmic sound became a mantra, a steady reminder that life continued even after the storm. Her mind churned with the revelations of the day, each memory interwoven with new insights. She remembered the face of the angry passenger on Flight 217, the furtive glances exchanged among her colleagues, and the anonymous notes that had haunted her nights. All of these were now pieces of a larger puzzle, one that she had finally begun to see in its brutal clarity. In the quiet solitude of the night, Margaret allowed herself to reflect on the journey that had led her here. For years, she had adhered to a set of rules without question, believing that they were the foundation of a fair and just system. Yet, as she now understood, those very rules had been manipulated to serve the interests of a select few. The revelation that the family she had once scolded was, in fact, the hidden power behind the airline was a betrayal that cut deeply, one that forced her to question not only her professional choices, but the very nature of her own morality. A cool breeze stirred, carrying with it the scent of rain that promised a fresh start. Margaret paused near a cluster of trees, their leaves rustling softly as the wind played through them. In that natural symphony, she found a metaphor for her own life, a cycle of growth, decay, and renewal. The wind, gentle yet insistent, reminded her that even after the harshest storms, there was always the potential for new life. She closed her eyes and let herself be enveloped by the sound, a quiet, constant murmur that seemed to whisper, "You can begin again." In that moment of introspection, the spiral of betrayal and deception that had so ensnared her began to unravel. She recalled the meeting, each word of confession, each tearful admission of guilt and regret. The raw pain of that day was undeniable, yet it had also served as a catalyst for her transformation. Margaret realized that she had a choice: to remain shackled by the weight of past mistakes, or to forge a new path defined by the courage to seek truth and embrace change. The decision, though fraught with uncertainty, glowed like a beacon in the darkness of her despair. Her thoughts drifted to the faces of those who had spoken at the meeting. Mr. Harrison's somber admission that the system was corrupt, Aaron's revelation of hidden monitoring, and Malik's earnest appeal for a new beginning all resonated within her. They had, in their own ways, acknowledged the injustice that had permeated their lives. And now, as she stood alone beneath the starry sky, Margaret knew that she was not the only one who had been wronged by a system that prized control over compassion. The night was filled with unspoken alliances, a silent understanding that many were now questioning the established order and seeking to rebuild it on a foundation of honesty and fairness. As she continued her walk, Margaret's mind turned to the future. The path ahead was uncertain, and she understood that any attempt to reform the system would be met with resistance. Yet, the memories of the day's revelations were a potent reminder that change was possible. Every small act of defiance, every whispered conversation in the dark corridors of the airport had the potential to spark a revolution, a quiet uprising against the forces that had manipulated them for so long. In the distance, the soft hum of the airport's operations provided a steady backdrop, a reminder that life continued unabated, regardless of the turmoil within. The distant sound of engines starting up, the murmur of voices inside the terminal, and even the rhythmic tapping of footsteps on concrete all combined to create a symphony of persistence. Margaret felt a surge of determination rise within her. The truth, painful as it was, had illuminated a path that she could no longer ignore. She resolved that she would not allow herself to be consumed by despair. Instead, she would channel her pain into action, a determination to expose the corruption that had infiltrated every facet of her world and to help rebuild a system that honored truth and dignity. With renewed resolve, Margaret made her way to a small park adjacent to the airport parking lot, a secluded spot where the urban clamor softened into gentle whispers of nature. Beneath a sprawling oak tree, she sat on a worn wooden bench, its surface etched with the stories of countless passers-by. The cool night air mingled with the earthy scent of the grass and leaves, and in that natural haven, she allowed herself to finally grieve for the loss of innocence and the betrayal of her own ideals. Tears welled in her eyes, but they were not solely tears of sorrow. Intermingled with the pain was a flicker of hope, a spark that refused to be extinguished by the weight of deception. In the quiet of the park, Margaret took out her journal, the same journal that had borne witness to her innermost fears and doubts over the past few weeks. With deliberate care, she opened it to a blank page and began to write. The words flowed out in a mixture of raw emotion and careful reflection, each sentence a testament to her journey from blind obedience to painful enlightenment. She wrote of the betrayal, the spiraling deception that had shattered her belief in the system she had once upheld. She wrote of the faces of those who had suffered silently under the yoke of a corrupt order, and of the whispered promises of change that now danced in the margins of her thoughts. The act of writing became a form of catharsis, a way to transform her anguish into a force that could propel her toward a brighter, more just future. As the night deepened and the stars arced slowly across the sky, Margaret closed her journal and leaned back against the rough bark of the oak. In that quiet moment, she allowed herself to be enveloped by the stillness of the night, a stillness that was both a balm and a call to action. The confrontation in the conference room, the painful admissions of her colleagues, and the bitter taste of betrayal had all converged to create a turning point in her life. She knew that the journey ahead would be treacherous, that every step toward exposing the truth might invite further hardship and isolation. Yet, the clarity of that moment filled her with a quiet determination. Margaret rose from the bench and began walking back toward the airport, her steps firm and resolute. The night had imparted a lesson that resonated deeply within her, that truth and justice were not passive ideals to be preserved in silence, but active forces that required courage, sacrifice, and the willingness to stand alone when necessary. With every stride, she felt the echo of that lesson, a promise that even in the depths of despair, the human spirit could ignite a flame that would light the way to redemption. Returning to the terminal, Margaret felt the atmosphere shift subtly. The corridors, once oppressive with the weight of unspoken secrets, now seemed to hum with the potential of a new beginning. She knew that the road to reform would be long and fraught with peril, and that the forces of deception would not yield their power without a fight. But she also understood that the spark of change had been lit in the hearts of those who dared to question the status quo. In that moment, as she passed by familiar faces, some wary, some supportive, she felt a collective stirring, an unspoken acknowledgement that they were all, in their own ways, ready to reclaim their dignity and rewrite the rules that had bound them for so long. In the days that followed, Margaret devoted herself to the arduous task of piecing together the remnants of a fractured system. She sought out quiet conversations with colleagues who, like her, were haunted by the memory of the conference room confrontation. In hushed tones and furtive glances, they began to share their stories, tales of quiet rebellion, of policies enforced without empathy, and of dreams stifled under the weight of corporate indifference. Each story, no matter how small, was a thread in the tapestry of their collective struggle, a tapestry that, when woven together, could become a powerful testament to the need for change. Margaret herself became a beacon of that emerging hope. In private meetings and whispered gatherings behind closed doors, she spoke passionately of a future where the rules were not instruments of control, but frameworks for genuine compassion and fairness. Her voice, once filled with uncertainty and regret, now resonated with a hard-won conviction. Even as the threat of retaliation loomed, a silent specter over every meeting and every conversation, she refused to let fear silence her determination. Every challenge, every act of betrayal that had once driven her into a spiral of despair now served as fuel for her resolve to transform the system from within. Standing at the crossroads of her past and her potential future, Margaret understood that the moral reflection born out of her experiences was not merely an internal journey, but a call to arms. The revelations of corruption, manipulation, and hidden agendas had fractured her former world, but they had also cleared away the illusions that had long obscured her vision. In their place was the promise of renewal, a future where truth and empathy would prevail over the cold calculus of power. As dawn broke on a new day, the pale light filtering through the terminal windows seemed to herald a fresh start. Margaret gazed out at the emerging day, her eyes reflecting both the scars of her painful journey and the glimmer of hope that now shone in its stead. With a deep, steadying breath, she resolved that she would never again allow herself to be a silent enforcer of unjust rules. Instead, she would become an advocate for change, a guardian of the truth whose actions would help to rebuild a system founded on the principles of compassion and fairness. In that quiet, resolute morning, Margaret stepped forward into a future filled with uncertainty and promise. Every step was a testament to her transformation, a declaration that even in the face of overwhelming betrayal and deception, the human spirit could rise, rebuild, and reclaim its dignity. And as she merged with the flow of the awakening crowd, each face carrying its own silent story of struggle and hope, she felt the unmistakable surge of a revolution, not one born of violence or anger, but of an unwavering commitment to truth and the belief that even the most broken system could be mended by the light of honest reflection. Thus, in the aftermath of that climactic confrontation, as Margaret embarked on the arduous journey of reform, the night's lessons remained etched in her heart, a constant reminder that the path to redemption was paved not with ease, but with the courage to face every hidden betrayal, every painful truth, and to emerge, scarred yet unbowed, into the radiant promise of a new day. Margaret woke to a gentle light filtering through the thin curtains of her small apartment the morning after the long, painful confrontation. The room was quiet now, no harsh voices, no stifling tension, and in that silence, she could almost hear the soft beating of her own heart as it adjusted to a new rhythm. It was as if the world, after so many turbulent hours, had finally granted her a moment to breathe. Slowly, she rose from her bed and walked to the window, where the early sun painted the sky in muted pinks and warm oranges. In that soft light, every shadow and every corner of her room seemed to whisper promises of renewal and hope. For weeks, Margaret had carried the heavy burden of betrayal, the weight of a system she had trusted, the sting of secrets unveiled, and the pain of watching her own convictions crumble. Now, standing at the threshold of a new day, she felt a mix of sorrow and relief. The raw emotions that had once threatened to drown her were beginning to settle into something gentler, something like acceptance. She had seen the darkest side of the system, and she had experienced the bitter taste of betrayal from those she once considered allies. Yet, Even as the memories pained her, they also lit a spark inside her, the realization that the truth, no matter how harsh, could lead to a better way of living. After a quiet breakfast, Margaret decided to take a walk. The streets near the airport were still, and the usual bustle had not yet fully returned. As she strolled along the sidewalk, the cool morning air brushed against her skin, and the distant hum of early traffic provided a steady, calming background. With each step, her thoughts wandered back over the events that had reshaped her life. She remembered the meeting in the cold conference room, where words had been exchanged like blows, confessions of guilt, admissions of corruption, and the final, shattering revelation that had turned her world upside down. In that room, she had heard voices both angry and sorrowful. Mr. Harrison's tone had been measured yet heavy with regret, and Aaron's words had cut through the haze of her confusion, forcing her to confront the uncomfortable truth that even those closest to her had played a part in the grand deception. Malik, with his calm dignity, had reminded her that the system was built on lies that served the powerful and silenced the weak. It was a truth that had shattered her former certainty, leaving her adrift in a sea of doubt and disillusionment. Now, as she walked slowly beneath the awakening sky, Margaret's mind was alive with reflections. Every building, every rustling tree, every distant sound became part of a larger tapestry of life, one that she was determined to reweave with honesty and compassion. She recalled the countless nights spent pouring her heart into her journal, each word a small act of rebellion against the system that had betrayed her. In those pages, she had written of her fear, her anger, and finally, her resolve to change not only herself, but the very order that had once seemed immutable. At a quiet park near the airport, Margaret found a weathered bench under an old oak tree. The tree's thick branches provided shelter, and its leaves whispered secrets in the light breeze. Here, in the natural stillness, she sat and allowed herself to feel every bit of the journey she had undergone. The park was empty at this early hour, offering her a private sanctuary where her thoughts could roam freely. She opened her journal to a fresh page and began to write, her handwriting slow but deliberate. She wrote of the moment when the truth had broken over her like a wave, the shock of learning that the family she had once reprimanded for causing a disturbance was, in fact, the secret power behind the airline. She wrote of the betrayal she felt when she discovered that those she had trusted, like James, had been forced to spy on her, their loyalty twisted by the pressure of a corrupt system. And she wrote of the loneliness that had settled in her heart, the bitter realization that every rule she had enforced had been designed not to protect people, but to maintain an order that favored only a few. Yet, in the midst of her sorrow, Margaret's words began to change tone. Slowly, she wrote of a small but profound hope that had taken root in her soul. She described the moment when she had looked into Malik's eyes during the meeting, seeing not malice, but a deep, resigned sorrow, a sorrow shared by many who had been caught in the machinery of power. She recalled Aaron's quiet determination and Mr. Harrison's reluctant acknowledgement that the system was not infallible. And in those recollections, she found a spark, the belief that even a broken system could be mended if those who suffered its injustice chose to stand together and rebuild it on new, honest terms. The pages of her journal soon filled with reflections on what it meant to be true to oneself in a world that demanded conformity. "I have been a guardian of rules," she wrote, "but I now see that blind obedience is not the same as righteousness. It is not enough to enforce a code if that code is built on prejudice and secrecy. I must seek to create a space where truth and compassion are the real measures of justice." Each sentence was a declaration of her intent to change, a promise to herself that she would no longer allow herself to be a mere instrument of a corrupt order. After writing for what felt like hours, Margaret closed her journal and sat back, gazing up at the sky. The park was bathed in the soft light of the approaching day, and the quiet rustle of the leaves mingled with the distant chirping of early birds. In that moment, she allowed herself to feel both the weight of her past mistakes and the possibility of redemption. The journey had not been easy. Every step had been marked by pain and sacrifice, but it had also taught her the value of questioning, of seeking truth even when it was hidden behind layers of deception. The moral implications of her journey weighed heavily on her mind. She thought about the many lives that had been affected by the policies she had once enforced without question, the passengers who had been treated as mere numbers, the colleagues who had lost their spirit of unity under the strain of corporate greed, and the quiet voices of dissent that had been silenced by fear. Now, she felt a deep responsibility not only to herself, but to all those who had suffered under the unjust system. Her struggle was not just personal, it was emblematic of a larger battle between power and the human spirit. Margaret knew that the road ahead would be fraught with challenges. Reform would not come overnight, and the forces that had long maintained control would not relinquish their grip easily. Yet, in the clarity of that early morning, she made a silent vow to herself. She would work to transform the system from within. She would speak out against injustice. She would support those who were willing to stand up and demand change, and she would never again allow fear to keep her silent. In her heart, she carried the conviction that every rule must be examined, every order questioned, and that true justice could only be achieved when the dignity of every person was respected. As she rose from the bench, Margaret felt a sense of calm determination settling over her. The path ahead was uncertain, but it was hers to choose. She walked back toward the airport with a steady pace, her eyes reflecting a mixture of past sorrow and newfound resolve. Along the way, she exchanged brief nods with a few early-rising colleagues who, though their faces were lined with worry, also bore expressions of quiet solidarity. In those small gestures, she saw the beginning of a collective awakening, a shared desire to challenge the status quo and rebuild a system that honored the truth. Back at the terminal, the atmosphere was still subdued, the remnants of the night's chill giving way to the gentle warmth of the rising sun. Margaret entered the building with a purposeful step, her mind already formulating plans for the days ahead. She arranged meetings with trusted colleagues and reached out to those who had also expressed doubts about the existing policies. In hushed conversations over steaming cups of coffee, they discussed ways to document the corruption they had witnessed, to compile evidence, and to present a united front that could not be ignored by the higher-ups. Each conversation, though cautious and measured, was infused with a sense of urgency. They shared stories of mistreatment, of moments when the rules had been applied not to protect, but to oppress. And as they spoke, Margaret found herself evolving from a lone dissenter into a leader among those who yearned for change. Her own journey, from a steadfast enforcer of rules to a seeker of truth, had given her the insight needed to guide others through the maze of deception. With every new idea, every plan to expose the hidden biases that had tainted their work, she felt the burden of her past begin to lift, replaced by the promise of a more just future. That afternoon, Margaret organized a small, discreet meeting in a quiet corner of the terminal's break room. The group, a mix of seasoned crew members and younger attendants, gathered around a small table, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of a single desk lamp. In the gentle hum of whispered voices, they began to lay out their vision, a blueprint for reform that centered on transparency, accountability, and empathy. Margaret spoke passionately about the need to rewrite the rules, not as rigid edicts handed down from above, but as living guidelines that respected the dignity of every person. She urged them to question every policy, to challenge every directive that seemed to serve only the interests of a select few. Her words were met with nods of agreement, and for the first time in many long months, Margaret felt a true sense of camaraderie. The moral reflection that had once been a solitary burden was now shared among a group of like-minded individuals, each ready to contribute to the fight for a fairer system. They talked of practical steps, setting up a committee to review internal policies, gathering anonymous testimonies, and creating a safe channel for whistleblowers. Every suggestion was a small victory, a step toward dismantling the old order and building something new from its remnants. Later that evening, after the meeting had dispersed into hopeful murmurs and determined glances, Margaret found herself alone once more in her modest office at the terminal. The quiet space, filled with the soft ticking of a clock and the distant sound of cleaning crews finishing their work provided her with a moment of solitude to reflect on everything that had transpired. She sat at her desk and opened her journal again, the pages now heavy with the chronicles of her personal transformation. In her writing that night, she poured out her inner thoughts with a candor that was both painful and liberating. She wrote about the moral implications of her journey, how her unquestioning loyalty to a set of rules had led her to become complicit in a system that valued power over people. She questioned the very nature of duty and obedience. Was it enough to simply follow orders, or did true service require the courage to stand up when those orders betrayed the fundamental principles of justice? Her words were simple and direct, yet they carried the weight of a lifetime spent in service, now transformed by the harsh light of truth. As she wrote, Margaret realized that her journey was not just about exposing corruption, it was about reclaiming her own humanity. The betrayal she had suffered had left deep scars, but those scars were also symbols of growth, reminders that even in the darkest moments, the possibility of renewal existed. She vowed that her future actions would be guided not by blind obedience, but by a sincere commitment to fairness and compassion. The transformation of her inner self, though wrought with pain, had given her the strength to imagine a world where every person's dignity was honored, and where the rules of society were built on mutual respect rather than coercion. By the time Margaret closed her journal that night, a sense of resolve had replaced the earlier turbulence in her heart. She knew that the road ahead would be difficult and that the struggle for justice would demand sacrifices, both personal and collective. Yet, she also recognized that the moral reflection she had undergone was not the end of her story, but the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter in which she would stand as a testament to the power of truth and the resilience of the human spirit. In the days and weeks that followed, Margaret dedicated herself to the arduous work of change. She participated in clandestine meetings with her colleagues, helped to draft proposals for policy reform, and even reached out to external advocates who had long fought for workers' rights. Every small step was a victory, every act of resistance a declaration that the old, unjust ways would no longer hold sway. And while the threat of retaliation still loomed large, the sense of solidarity among those who had once felt isolated grew stronger each day. One afternoon, as Margaret walked through the terminal with a renewed sense of purpose, she paused to look around at the faces of the people bustling about their daily lives. In each face, she saw a story of struggle, hope, and the quiet determination to live with dignity. It was in that moment that she truly understood the moral lesson of her journey, that even the most broken systems could be healed when ordinary people chose to care for one another, when they decided that truth and compassion were worth fighting for. Sitting on a bench near the departure gate, Margaret watched as passengers reconnected with loved ones and strangers exchanged friendly smiles. The air was filled with a gentle optimism, a promise that despite the scars of the past, a brighter future was within reach. In that reflective stillness, she allowed herself a small, sincere smile. She knew that her journey had not been in vain. Every tear, every moment of despair had led her to this profound understanding, that the essence of humanity was not found in rigid adherence to rules, but in the ability to learn, to grow, and to rebuild from even the deepest wounds. As the sun began to set on that day, casting long shadows over the terminal and bathing everything in a warm, golden glow, Margaret felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. She was grateful for the painful lessons that had forced her to look within, for the chance to join hands with others who shared her vision of change, and for the opportunity to finally stand up for what was right. The moral weight of her journey had transformed her into someone capable of leading not by authority, but by example, by showing that even when betrayal cuts deep, the heart can still choose forgiveness, renewal, and hope. In the quiet moments of that evening, as Margaret prepared to leave the terminal and return to her small apartment, she paused one last time to look up at the darkening sky. The stars were beginning to twinkle, each one a distant beacon of light in a vast, uncertain universe. In their steady glow, she saw a reflection of her own inner strength, a reminder that even in the darkest night, there is beauty and promise. With that thought warming her spirit, she stepped forward into the future. Margaret's journey had come full circle. From the day she had unquestioningly enforced the rules to the moment she had shattered her own illusions and embraced the painful truth, she had undergone a transformation that was both heart-wrenching and empowering. Now, standing at the threshold of a new era, she carried with her the lessons of her past and the unyielding determination to create a world where justice was measured not by power, but by empathy and truth. As she walked away from the terminal, her steps sure and unhurried, Margaret felt a quiet peace settle over her. She knew that the fight for change was far from over and that many challenges still lay ahead. But she also knew that she was no longer alone. In every face she encountered, in every quiet smile shared with a fellow traveler, she saw the promise of a community united by the belief that a better world was possible. In that final, reflective moment, Margaret understood that her journey was not defined by the betrayal she had suffered, but by the choices she had made in response. She had chosen to question, to learn, and ultimately to stand up for the truth, even when it meant facing overwhelming odds. And in that choice lay the moral heart of her story, that the courage to confront injustice and the willingness to rebuild from the ashes can light the way to a future where every soul is treated with dignity and compassion. With the night embracing her and the promise of a new dawn on the horizon, Margaret continued her journey, not as a broken enforcer of flawed rules, but as a guardian of a renewed vision, ready to help shape a world where truth and love reign supreme. Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more meaningful stories. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.